Lord have mercy, I see a lot of y'all out the window right now, but there's room for more. If I told you they were going to open up the fairgrounds for you, y'all be coming up from Titusville, Mason City, and Sister Tammy, leave your chiffon at home. We don't need you backsliding.
Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever.
I know that.
The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself. And that is what has happened to the American Negro. Something within has reminded him of his birthright of freedom, and something without has reminded him that it can be gained. He is moving with a sense of great urgency toward the promised land of racial justice. If one recognizes this vital urge that has engulfed the Negro community, he should readily understand why public demonstrations are taking place. The Negro has many pent-up resentments and latent frustrations, and he must release them. So let him march. Let him make prayer pilgrimages to the city hall. Let him go on freedom rides and try to understand why he must do so. If his repressed emotions are not released in nonviolent ways, they will seek expression through violence. This is not a threat, but a fact of history. I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent. Rather, I have tried to say that this normal and healthy discontent can be channeled into a creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. And now this approach is being termed extremist.
Extremism will not work in our community.
Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies and bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like the waters and righteousness like an overflowing stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? Perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists.
As a leader in the church, I have a heavy responsibility to our religious groups.
I am thankful that some of our white brothers have grasped the meaning of this social revolution and committed themselves to it. Unlike so many of their white brothers and sisters, they have recognized the urgency of the moment and sensed the need for powerful action, antidotes to combat the disease of segregation. I am not unmindful of the fact that each of you has taken some significant stance on this issue. Though there are some notable exceptions, I have been disappointed with the white church and its leadership. I do not say this as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say this as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who was nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall be lengthened. When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama a few years ago, I felt we would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent and secure behind stained glass windows. In spite of my shattered dreams, I came to Birmingham with the hope that the white religious leadership of this community would see the justice of our cause with deep moral concern and would serve as the channel through which our just grievances could reach the power structure. But again, I have been disappointed. I have heard numerous Southern religious leaders admonish their worshipers to comply with the desegregation decision because it is the law. But I have longed to hear white ministers declare, follow this decree because integration is morally right and because the Negro is your brother. In the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churchmen stand on the sidelines and mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I have heard many ministers say, those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern. And I have watched many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which makes a strange, unbiblical distinction between body and soul, between the sacred and the secular. I have traveled the length and breadth of Alabama, Mississippi, and all the other southern states. On sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at the South's beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward, and at her impressive religious education buildings. Over and over, I have found myself asking, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? Where were their voices when the lips of the Governor Barnett dripped with words of interposition and nullification? Where were their voices of support when bruised and weary Negro men and women decided to rise from the dark dungeons of complacency to the bright hills of creative protest? Yes, these questions are still in my mind. In deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church. But be assured that my tears have been tears of love. There was a time when the church was very powerful, and the time when the early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed in. In those days, church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Whenever the early Christians entered a town, the power structure immediately sought to convict them for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But the Christians pressed on in the conviction that they were a colony of heaven called to obey God rather than man. Things are different now. The contemporary church is so often a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. It is so often the arch supporter of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's often vocal sanction of things as they are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If the church of today does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authentic ring, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future. I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham, even if our motives are presently misunderstood. We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation, because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with the destiny of America.
We urge the public to continue to show restraint should the demonstrations continue, and the law enforcement officials to remain calm and continue to protect our city from violence. We appeal to both our white and Negro citizenry to observe the principles of law and order and common sense.
Before closing, I am impelled to mention one other point in your statement that troubled me profoundly. I don't believe you would have so warmly commended the police force if you had seen its angry, violent dogs literally biting 6 unarmed, non-violent Negroes. I don't believe you would so quickly commend the policemen if you would have observed their ugly and inhuman treatment of Negroes here in the city jail. If you would have watched them push and curse old Negro women and young Negro girls, if you would see them slap and kick old Negro men and young boys, if you would observe them as they did on 2 occasions, refusing to give us food because we wanted to sing grace together. I'm sorry that I can't join you in your praise for the police department. I wish you had commended the Negro demonstrators of Birmingham for their sublime courage, their willingness to suffer, and their amazing discipline in the midst of the most inhuman provocation. One day, the South will recognize its real heroes. They will be the James Merediths, courageously and with a majestic sense of purpose, facing jeering and hostile mobs and agonizing loneliness that characterizes the life of the pioneer. They will be old, oppressed, battered Negro women symbolized in a 72-year-old woman of Montgomery, Alabama, who rose up with a sense of dignity and with her people decided not to ride the segregated buses and responded to one who inquired about her tiredness with ungrammatical profundity. My feet is tired, but my soul is rested. There will be young high school and college students, young ministers of the gospel, and a host of their elders courageously and nonviolently sitting in at lunch counters and willingly going to jail for the conscience's sake. One day, the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters and they were in the reality standing up for the best in the American dream and the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage. Never before have I written a letter this long, or should I say a book. I'm afraid that it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that if I would have been much shorter if I'd been writing from a comfortable desk, but what else is there to do when you are alone for a few days in the dull monotony of a narrow jail cell, other than write long letters, think strange thoughts, and pray long prayers? If I've said anything in this letter that is an understatement of the truth and is indicative of an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. And if I have said anything in this letter that is an overstatement of the truth and is indicative of my having a patience that makes me a patient with anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King Jr.